How about we actually cover, I know this,
what, you don't want
news
to be,
topics.
You don't want to be here 20.
It is we are 9 minutes and 30 seconds into this. How about we cover the first news topic?
Oh, did you pull mine out?
I pulled them all up for you. Today's video was brought to you by eWin Racing, the best source for gaming chairs and desks for those long gaming sessions. We have a playlist of our eWin chair and desk videos linked in the video description below. Save 30% off of everything using the discount code TechDeals. More details at the end of the video.
Let's see. Silicon Lottery, their store is closing. If you're not familiar with them, they would delid the CPUs and beef them up a bit and sell them.
And they also had a delidding service where you could send in your own CPU and they'll delid it for you. But the problem is there's
not much overclocking in them anymore. And
yeah, if you read through this, the short version is when they started 7 years ago, you could take a 3.5 or 4 gigahertz CPU and overclock it to 4.5 or 5 gigahertz. Just as an example, the i7 2600K, which granted predates them, that's 10 years ago, the 2600K would run in the mid, 3.5 gigahertz range. 4.5 gigahertz was relatively easy. My own i7 2600K on a 120 millimeter liquid cooler, which really is kind of sad, to be honest with you. This is not a big fancy cooler here. It'll do 4.5 at stock voltage all day long, and it did it for years without any complaints. The new chips have no overclocking headroom in them whatsoever. The last new CPUs that had any overclocking headroom worth a darn was the first gen Ryzen chips.
Yeah, you
a Ryzen 7 1700 has stock out-of-the-box all-core turbo of 3.2 gigahertz. But the new chips, a Ryzen 7 5800X, what are you going to get? Another 100 megahertz out of it? Why?
Yeah, it says here when you read through it, I don't know if you're going to pull it up, tighter binning means that there's less overclocking available. And so what's the point of delidding something to overclock it if there's just no overclocking available?
They were going through a lot of CPUs not getting anything better than stock. Basically, Intel is already...
Well, and it also says here that Intel switched from a polymer TIM back to a solder TIM starting with their 9th gen.
Let me translate for you. They switched from toothpaste to real solder.
Yeah.
The i7 8700K had an all-core turbo of 4.3, and the 9900K had an all-core turbo of 4.7. Both 14 nanometer, but the 8700K at 4.3 was often the same temperature as a 9900K with 8 cores at 4.7. And that's because the 9900K was actually built right. It cost them, 50 cents more per chip. Whereas the 8700K had that awful toothpaste. An 8700K is worth delidding. A 9900K is not.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a chance you'll break a 9900K because it's soldered underneath.
Exactly.
If you take the integrated heat spreader off, you may actually chip the actual die in the process. So yeah, what do you guys think, chat? What do you guys think about the fact that overclocking isn't really a thing anymore? I see people talk about it, but we haven't talked about overclocking for a while. I've made a video about it for a while. Mm-hmm. I've messed with it. I mean, I've tried a few things, but I mean, they're like take the 1700X was 3.5 all-core turbo.
Right.
The 2700X was 4.2. And 4.3 or 4.4 is about all you'll ever get out of a 2700X unless you're really lucky or you pour voltage in it that's going to damage the chip long term. A 100 megahertz overclock on a 4.2 gigahertz chip is a waste of your time.
It's kind of like,
I think I'll ask in chat.
Fun to tinker with.
What? No, is it? There's no tinkering to be had. There's nothing left to begin. It'd be fun to tinker if you could actually get 500 megahertz more clock speed, but I'll bet there's a lot of people who overclock their CPU and they run worse.
Oh, probably.
Because the all-core turbo that you set it to a fixed speed is lower than the 1, 2, and 3 core boosts that can be obtained if you just let it run automatically. And if you put a decent cooler on, for example, the modern AMD chips with Precision Boost Overdrive, they'll overclock as much as the chip's got.
Yeah.
Within 100 or 200 megahertz of anything you could obtain yourself. Well, I'll just throw up a quick poll and see what you guys think in chat. Now, there used to be a time when overclocking was a big thing. Now, for those of you newer to the PC business, you know what I'm sure people are going to say, why does everybody talk about overclocking if you say it sucks so much?
Back in the day.
Back in my day.
There it is.
You heard that coming, didn't you?
Yep.
Well, let me rewind time. Many people could take a 6 or an 8 megahertz 286 and change the clock crystal on the motherboard. There were no multipliers back then. You actually had to change the frequency resonance crystal on the board, and they were usually soldered on, and sometimes you had to, this was the old days, you actually had to desolder them and put a new one on. Because you could buy a crystal for, $1. And then you could put a new crystal on, and the chip will run at whatever speed the crystal's at. The problem is, some of the early boards, especially the IBM AT5170s, the onboard controllers and the controller cards were never meant to run at the higher speed, and the bus speed and the RAM runs at the same speed as the CPU,
Right.
and so you throw things off. Later 286s handled this with either a clock divider for the bus and the RAM, or they just had better components by this point later in the generation.
Right.
386s, many 386 DX25s would run at 33 if you just changed the clock crystal. I had a 386 DX25. Did I overclock it? No, because I didn't know you could, and I didn't know it was a thing, and this pre-internet era.
Well, you were young, though.
Well, I was 15. But if I could go back in time to 1991, I'll bet you that 386-25 would run at 33 just fine. It might not, but it probably would. The 486s were often very overclockable. And then, of course, you move on. I know those are ancient history to a lot of people. Who here remembers the Celery 300A? Okay, fine. It's technically called the Celeron. That was a stupid name. Everybody back in the 90s called them Celeries. Well, everybody I hung out with. Maybe I hung out with weird people. Because the Celeron was a stupid name. You had Pentiums and Celerons. And because the Celerons were the super budget chips designed for low-end machines, it was like a stock of cell. It was just
Right.
they were lame.
Mm-hmm.
The Celeron 300 was a cashless chip that really wasn't that great because it had no onboard cache. But the Celeron 300A had 128K of level 2 cache on the... Initially, they were slot 1s on the daughter card. Then they were socket 370s. The Pentium 2 450
right?
was like a $500 or $600 CPU.
That's a lot.
And it had 256K of cache on the slot 1 card or on the die. The Celeron 300A ran at a 66 megahertz bus speed. The Pentium 2 ran at 100. If you put the Celeron 300A on a 440BX motherboard and you switched the front side bus of the motherboard from 66 to 100, 9 times out of 10, and I did this with a bunch of machines back then, 9 times out of 10, it ran at 450 megahertz without an issue. It was a 50% overclock, and the Celeron 300As were under $200. So you'd spend $160 and get a $500 CPU. You did get half the level 2 cache. You only got 128K instead of 256, but that was a minor penalty for those kind of savings. And I used one of those for a couple of years. We sold a bunch of those. Technically, we probably shouldn't have sold them that way, but we did. People loved them.
That's not available today.
And then you even come to the newer eras. You come to the Core 2 Duos, Core 2 Quads, and then finally the Sandy Bridge, which was probably the last of the really big overclockable chips. Even Haswell was only so overclockable. I mean, I've got an i7 4770K stock. A 4770K runs at 3.6 gigahertz on all the cores. It will, on almost any reasonable cooler, run at 4.0. And it will run at 4.3 or 4.4 on a somewhat decent cooler. To get much higher than that, you have to start throwing voltage at it and start tweaking settings and maybe get a little bit lucky with the silicon lottery.
We started talking about CPUs and someone popped their head up.
I see. It's Mr. Silicon wafer eating dude.
Hi, Ian. It's like CPUs.
Yeah, there were CPUs that had disabled cores that could be re-enabled before they started lasering them off. I do remember the Cyrexes. The Cyrexes got a bad rap because of Quake and a variety of other reasons. The Cyrexes were actually a really good deal, and it's a shame they didn't survive. We really could have used them as competition, but they were late on their M2, and they were late on some of their projects. And, of course, they got they also got... Don't be late.
Don't be late. What?
You don't want to be late.
I don't want to be late.
We have 3 kids. So, to regale a quick story about Cyrex, for those of you who don't remember, the Pentiums were good, but very quickly overtaken by some of the competitor chips. And in many regards, a Cyrex 6x86, which would drop into a SuperSocket 7, which was basically the same socket with a few BIOS updates that the Pentiums would stick into. A Cyrex 6x86 was a better CPU, closer to a Pentium Pro, but it would drop into the Pentium motherboards. But it had a flaw. And it wasn't really a flaw, but it was a flaw in that it was very unlucky. Have you heard of John Carmack?
Carmack?
Yes.
Yes, I have.
Have you heard of John Romero?
Yes.
Have you heard of id Software?
Yes.
Okay. You've heard of Doom.
Yes.
You've heard of Quake.
Yes.
John Carmack was the programming genius behind them, and John Romero was sort of the design, and he was the artsy-fartsy brain guy of that particular group. And John Carmack, who was, and still is today, very brilliant, discovered an interesting thing with the Pentium processor. Now, the 486 has an onboard math coprocessor, but it's not a great one. It's better than the 386 math coprocessor, but it's not epic. It just is there. The Pentium's math coprocessor was much better, and it contained a interesting undocumented thing that John Carmack found and put into Quake. Normally, on a CPU, you can use the integer compute, which is 2 plus 2 equals 4, or you can use the floating point unit, which is decimals and powers and fractions and other things.
Correct.
So you can either use the floating point unit or the integer unit, but you cannot use both of them at the same time because then you ended up with a 2-core processor. We didn't have 2-core processors in 1995. Or did we? He discovered that there was an undocumented feature, bug, quirk, whatever, of the Pentium chip, which allowed you to use both the floating point side and the integer side at the same time in certain circumstances. And he used it in Quake. And it's why Quake on the Pentium isn't just a bit faster than a 486. It's why it functions on a Pentium and it doesn't on a 486. The Cyrex doesn't have that thing. So on the Cyrex, it had to alternate between the floating point and the integer unit. And so Quake ran very nice on a Pentium, and it ran like hot garbage on a Cyrex, and all the gaming magazines and publications of the era came out and used that as the example, benchmarks, of why the Cyrex chip sucked. And in fairness, it did for Quake, but it really didn't for anything else. Almost every other programming game was very competitive on the Cyrex chip, but everything was about Quake. That was all you read about in the media, and so plenty of people thought, well, they sucked then.
And not in the good way.
So in any case, that's just an interesting aside. Somebody brought up Cyrex in chat, and I thought I would mention that. So Silicon Lottery is shutting down because there's no overclocking left in chips. Let's see where we're at on the poll.
Is there nothing else they can do?
That's their shtick. What else would they do?
I don't know. But that's why businesses go out of business if there's nothing else for them to do. Did you end that? We do have a poll going, guys. Do you overclock your CPU? 83% said no and 16% said yes.
Steve says that he remembers swapping a Cyrex chip for an Intel just to play NHL hockey. You are not wrong, and I remember those days. The AMD and the Cyrex chips could be very hit and miss. The first AMD chips were K5s, and honestly, they sucked. I sold a crap ton of them to businesses. We installed in the late 90s, in 97 and 98, so many K5s. They were cheap. They were really cheap. And you could advertise, a fifth gen processor, Pentium equivalent. Because what the advertising sheet would say is AMD K5 P75. Because the P, everybody thought that the P stood for, Pentium, which they kind of wanted it to, even though they never explicitly said it. It was supposed to be performance, like performs like a Pentium 75, and then they later changed it from P to PR, and they officially called it performance rating, and then they picked a set of benchmarks that they said they were using. It's a bunch of crap. It was meant to be compared to a Pentium. I know it, Intel knew it, AMD knew it, Cyrex knew it. Nobody was fooled. But in any case, so the AMD K5 P75s were not P75s. I mean, they really weren't. In some regards, depends on what you're doing, but I'd almost rather have a 486DX 4133, which AMD also labeled as a 5x86 P75, which confused the crap out of everybody because they sold a K5 P75 and a 5x86 P75, which was really a 486DX 4133. To everybody who thinks Intel is the only one who's ever done crap naming and awful products, they are not. Fun fact,
Yeah.
the Cyrex 5x86 and the Cyrex 6x86 were completely different chips, but both SuperSocket 7 compatible, and they dropped into the same board. And how about this one? Cyrex sold a 486 DLC and a 486 SLC, which were 386 chips, and dropped into 386 boards. If I had known back then, I could have actually upgraded my Gateway 2000 386 DX25 to a Cyrex 486 DLC.
Oh, yeah.
Except you'd still be limited by some things on... I mean, same reason the Pentium overdrives never worked. They really don't. Technically, a Pentium overdrive... the top Pentium overdrive was an 83 megahertz chip. And in theory, and of course if you want to run Quake, you would need it. A Pentium overdrive at 83 megahertz is better than a 486 DX4133. Not really. There's too many compatibility issues because it's a Pentium core on a 486 board that was never designed for it. And you know what a Pentium chip is really looking for? And they had no... Intel, it was delayed and delayed and delayed, and they promised it, and by the time it came out, nobody cared anyway. What does a Pentium look for that most 486 boards don't have? Now, this predates her era, so if she doesn't know, it's not her fault. This was a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Does that have something to do with the floating point things?
No, it's the motherboard. What's missing on a 486 motherboard that is present on Pentium motherboards?
RAM? Something to do with
The
RAM?
PCI Express, the PCI bus, not Express.
Oh, the
Express didn't
bus.
come out for years later. The Pentium was designed to use the PCI bus, peripheral component interconnect. The 46 was designed to use the ISA-bus, and very few 46 boards had a PCI bus. They later came out with a bridge chip which allowed PCI to be added to 486s, but it wasn't really meant to be used on it. They sort of backported it to the 486 just to enable the 486 to be used for a couple years longer. The big high-speed bus for 486s was Visa Local Bus, which had all kinds of timing issues and trace length issues. It was a neat idea at the time, but the Visa Local Bus couldn't be forward ported to the Pentium, which is why they had to come out with PCI. And PCI is a proper bus, whereas the Visa Local Bus really was, it's sort of, it was a backdoor port to the 486 because it actually used the 486's local bus to get direct communication to the CPU bypassing the motherboard's ISA-bus, giving it a high-speed 32-bit connection.
Right.
But it was very picky about what you plugged in there because the cards had to work together. So if you had 2 or 3 Visa Local Bus slots and you put a SCSI card in one and a VGA card in another, and they didn't like each other, they could step on each other's signals because there was no protocol to control signaling.
Right.
And there was no safety mechanism to reset the bus because they had direct access to the CPU. There was no gatekeeper. With the ISA bus, with the PCI bus and PCI Express, the the bus can be reset, and there's a logic controller that controls the devices that can talk. But on the Visa local bus, it's like a hardline connection straight into the chip with no safeties. It generally worked pretty well when you only used one card and generally a video card, and you put nothing else in those slots. I know, because I had a SCSI Visa card, and it was no end of trouble. I remember that.
There you go.
Very well.
Now you know why.
The more you know.
Still want to delid your 8700K? Good luck with that.
Well, you can.
Yeah, you can.
Well, Silicon Lottery's not closed their doors yet. They're closing at the end of this month. They'll still delid your chip. They actually said in their notice, can't believe we've been going on Silicon Lottery for 20 minutes. So this was supposed to be a 5-minute story. This is why our live streams are 3 hours. So.
Oh, you need to explain it to me.
But you have to admit that backstory was kind of interesting. At least, folks, tell me, was that backstory interesting? Do you like hearing that kind of stuff? Because if you don't, I guess I could just shut up, but, you know. Okay, poll time.
Okay, poll time.
Did you like that walkthrough history? Yes? No. It was easier, by the way. It's all this commentary regarding the different chips, the K5, the K6, which was much better, the Cyrex chips, 5x86, 6x86. Here's the fun part. Cyrex had a 5x86, and AMD had a 5x86. AMD's 5x86 was a 486-133 that went into a socket 3 on a 46 board. Cyrex's 5x86 was a socket 7 that went into a Pentium board. And their 486 went on a 386 board. This is all very simple now. I mean, in my brain now, this is all very logical because I have the benefit of hindsight and because it's like finished, and so nothing's changing about it anymore. And so I've since memorized it and learned it. Rewind back to 1994, and it's confusing AF. You're in the middle of it?
Yeah.
And Google doesn't exist.
Nope.
So back then, it was much harder to learn all this stuff. It wasn't all free. I mean, the amount of magazines you'd have to read and the amount of,
Well, yeah, you actually had to.
Well, there was Usenet and there was BBS's message groups and stuff you could chat with people, but it was not like today.
No.
So.
No, where everyone can be an expert.
And yet they're still not.
No.
Yes.
No. Zach, thank you. He says, hey guys, this is quickly becoming my favorite channel. Well, thanks, Zach. I was lucky enough to get a 6900 XT. Realistically, how long will I be able to play 1440p Ultra? Well, it depends what games you're playing. If you're playing AAA brand new games.
3 years, maybe? 2 to 4 years. Yeah. It depends.
It depends.
Because one game has to come out which torpedoes that. But for the most part, yeah, you'll get multiple years out of that. eWin Racing has a wide selection of chairs to fit all shapes and sizes of gamers, ranging from petite to cuddly. They have something for every type of gamer. Not just sizes, but colors and material options as well, including red, blue, purple, pink, orange, and more, plus cloth and leather choices. We have over half a dozen chair and desk videos in a playlist down in the video description below. We also have a very special offer just for Tech Deals viewers. Save 30% off of everything using discount code TechDeals using our link in the video description. We have used eWin gaming chairs for 3 years in our office, sitting on them for up to 8-hour marathon live streams. They are very comfortable, and we are happy to work with eWin to bring you this special discount and recommend eWin for all of your gaming chair and desk needs.